The first time Maggie Lawson stepped off the stagecoach in Nevada City, California, in the late spring of 1876, the townspeople didn't know what to make of her. She wore a high-necked dress buttoned all the way to her chin despite the warmth of the afternoon, and long sleeves that covered every inch of her arms, and when she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, it wasn't against the cold but against the weight of their stares. Thomas Turner was mending a fence outside the general store when he first saw her, his hammer pausing mid-swing as she walked past with her head held high and her eyes fixed straight ahead. There was something about the way she moved, careful and deliberate, like someone who had learned to take up as little space as possible in the world. Her brown hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her face, though young and pretty, held an expression of such guarded wariness that it made his chest ache with a protective instinct he didn't quite understand. He watched as she made her way to the boarding house run by Mrs. Patterson, a kindly widow who had advertised for help in the local paper. Thomas had heard about the new girl coming to town, hired sight unseen through a series of letters, but he hadn't expected someone who looked so fragile and yet so fiercely determined at the same time. That evening, Thomas found himself at the boarding house for supper, something he did occasionally since Mrs. Patterson set a fine table and welcomed paying guests. He took his usual seat near the window and waited, his eyes drifting to the kitchen door more often than they should have. When Maggie emerged carrying a tray of biscuits, their eyes met for the briefest moment. Hers were a deep brown, almost black, and in that instant of connection he saw something that made his breath catch. Pain. Deep, soul-crushing pain that no person so young should have to carry. She looked away quickly, setting the biscuits on the table with hands that trembled slightly, and Thomas noticed how she kept her sleeves pulled down over her wrists even as she worked. "Thank you, miss," he said quietly, his voice gentler than usual. She nodded without speaking and hurried back to the kitchen. Mrs. Patterson settled into the chair across from him with a satisfied sigh. "That girl is a hard worker, I'll give her that. Been here less than a day and she's already cleaned the entire upstairs and helped me prepare this whole meal. Doesn't say much though, quiet as a mouse." "Where's she from?" Thomas asked, trying to sound casual as he buttered a biscuit. "Back east somewhere. Philadelphia, I believe. Her letter said she was looking for a fresh start and heaven knows I needed the help." Mrs. Patterson lowered her voice. "Between you and me, Thomas, I think she's running from something, or someone. I've seen that look before." Thomas's jaw tightened. He'd seen that look before too, on women who'd suffered at the hands of men who should have protected them. His own mother had worn that expression for years, before she finally found the courage to take him and his sister and leave his father. Over the following weeks, Thomas found excuses to visit the boarding house more often than necessary. He fixed a loose step on the front porch, replaced a broken window, and repaired the pump in the kitchen. Each time, he caught glimpses of Maggie as she went about her work, always covered from neck to wrist, always moving with that same careful deliberation. She began to nod at him when they passed, and once, when he handed her a bucket of water he'd drawn from the newly fixed pump, she whispered, "Thank you." Her voice was soft and musical, and he found himself thinking about it long after he'd left. One particularly hot afternoon in June, Thomas was replacing some rotted boards on the boarding house's back porch when he heard a crash from inside, followed by a muffled cry. He dropped his hammer and rushed through the back door to find Maggie standing in the kitchen, her hand pressed to her mouth, staring at a broken pitcher on the floor. Water pooled around the ceramic shards, and she was trembling from head to toe. "It's all right," Thomas said quickly, holding up his hands. "It's just a pitcher, nothing to worry about." But Maggie didn't seem to hear him. Her eyes were wide and unfocused, and she was breathing in short, sharp gasps. Thomas recognized panic when he saw it. He moved slowly, careful not to startle her further. "Maggie, Miss Lawson, look at me." Her eyes flickered to his face. "It's just a broken pitcher," he repeated, his voice steady and calm. "Accidents happen. Nobody's going to hurt you." At those last words, something in her expression cracked, and she sank down onto a nearby chair, her whole body shaking. Thomas grabbed a towel and began cleaning up the water and broken ceramic, giving her time to collect herself. "I'm sorry," she finally whispered. "I don't know what came over me." "Nothing to apologize for," Thomas said, disposing of the shards in a bucket. He pulled out a chair and sat down across from her, maintaining a respectful distance. "We all have things that set us off sometimes." Maggie looked at him then, really looked at him, as if trying to determine whether she could trust him. Thomas held her gaze steadily, letting her see that he meant no harm. "My husband," she said suddenly, the word coming out like something bitter she needed to spit out, "used to throw things when he was angry. Plates, glasses, whatever was nearby, sometimes at the wall, sometimes at me." Thomas felt his hands clench into fists under the table, but he kept his expression calm. "Used to, he's dead." She said it without emotion, as if she were commenting on the weather. 6 months ago, fell off his horse drunk and broke his neck." "I'm sorry," Thomas said automatically, though he wasn't sorry at all. "I'm not." Maggie met his eyes again, and this time there was defiance in her gaze. "Does that make me a terrible person?" "No," Thomas said firmly. "It makes you honest." Something in her shoulders relaxed slightly. "Mrs. Patterson doesn't know. About my husband, I mean. She knows I'm a widow, but not about the rest of it." "Your secret's safe with me," Thomas promised. A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Why are you being so kind to me?" Thomas considered the question carefully. "Because everyone deserves kindness. And because I know what it's like to grow up in a house full of fear." They sat in companionable silence for a moment, and Thomas noticed that Maggie's sleeves had gotten wet when she tried to catch the falling pitcher. The fabric clung to her forearms, and even in the dim kitchen light, he could see the shadows of marks beneath the material. Maggie noticed where his gaze had landed and quickly pulled her arms against her body, but she didn't get up and run away. Instead, she took a deep breath and said, "It lasted 5 years. The marriage. I was 18 when my father arranged it. Jacob was 35 and successful, and my father thought I was lucky to have attracted his attention." Her voice was flat now, reciting facts. "The first time he hit me was on our wedding night because I cringed when he touched me. It got worse from there." Thomas felt rage building in his chest, hot and fierce, but he pushed it down. Maggie didn't need his anger right now. She needed his understanding. "The scars," she continued, her voice barely above a whisper, "some are from his fists, some from his belt, some from the time he pushed me into the fireplace, some from when he threw a lamp at me and it shattered against my back." "Maggie," Thomas said softly. "I know I'm damaged," she said quickly, as if she needed to get the words out before she lost her courage. "I know no decent man would want someone like me, but I needed you to know. You've been so kind coming around here, and I thought maybe you were interested, and I couldn't let you think I was something I'm not." Thomas leaned forward, his eyes intense. "Now you listen to me, Maggie Lawson. You are not damaged. You're a survivor. What was done to you was evil and wrong, but it doesn't define who you are. Do you understand me?" Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she wiped at them impatiently. "You don't know what I look like under these clothes." "I don't need to," Thomas said. "But if you ever want to show me, I promise you that nothing I see will change the way I see you." Maggie stared at him for a long moment, searching his face for any sign of deception or disgust. Finding none, she stood up abruptly. I need to finish preparing dinner. Thomas stood too. All right. But Maggie, I am interested, just so you know. He left before she could respond, but he could feel her eyes on his back as he walked out the door. After that day, something shifted between them. Maggie still wore her high-necked dresses and long sleeves, but she began to seek out Thomas's company rather than avoid it. She would sit on the porch in the evenings after her work was done, and Thomas would join her, and they would talk about everything and nothing. He told her about growing up with a violent father, and how his mother had finally taken him and his sister Sarah West when he was 15. She told him about her childhood in Philadelphia, about the mother who had died when she was 12, and the father who had seen her as nothing more than a commodity to be traded for social advancement. Thomas was careful never to move too fast or touch her without permission. He learned to read her moods, to recognize when she was having a difficult day and needed space, and when she needed the comfort of his presence. In July, the town held its annual summer dance. Thomas had never been one for social gatherings, but he found himself standing outside the boarding house on the evening of the dance, dressed in his best shirt and vest, holding a small bouquet of wildflowers he'd picked that afternoon. Mrs. Patterson answered his knock with a knowing smile. "She's just finishing up in the kitchen. I'll send her out." When Maggie emerged, Thomas's breath caught. She was wearing a simple blue dress, still modest and still covering her arms and throat, but her hair was down, falling in soft waves around her shoulders, and she looked beautiful. "These are for you," he said, offering the flowers. Maggie took them with trembling hands, bringing them to her nose to smell the delicate blooms. "They're lovely. But Thomas, I don't know if I can go to the dance. All those people, all that noise and touching." "We don't have to stay long," Thomas said. "Just one dance if you can manage it, and if it gets to be too much, we'll leave. No questions asked." She considered this, then nodded slowly. One dance. The dance was being held in the town square, where lanterns had been strung between buildings, and a small group of musicians was playing lively tunes. Thomas kept Maggie's hand tucked safely in the crook of his arm as they walked, feeling the way she tensed every time someone passed too close. When they reached the square, he led her to the edge of the dancing area, away from the densest part of the crowd. The band struck up a waltz, and Thomas turned to her, holding out his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Lawson?" Maggie looked at his hand for a long moment before placing hers in it. Thomas drew her close, but not too close, maintaining a respectful distance between their bodies. He could feel how rigid she was, how much courage this simple act of trust required. "Look at me," he said quietly. "Don't look at anyone else, just me." She lifted her eyes to his, and Thomas began to move, leading her gently through the steps of the waltz. At first she was stiff and mechanical, but gradually, as the music continued and Thomas held her gaze, she began to relax. "You're doing fine," he murmured. "Just fine." "I haven't danced since my wedding," Maggie said, and then winced at the memory. "Then this will be a new memory," Thomas said firmly. "A good one to replace the bad." They completed one full dance, and when it ended, Maggie was actually smiling. "That wasn't as terrible as I thought it would be." "High praise indeed," Thomas said with a grin. "Want to try for two?" She did, and then three, and they might have stayed for a fourth if a drunken miner hadn't stumbled into Maggie from behind, causing her to gasp and pull away from Thomas's arms. The man apologized profusely, but the damage was done. Maggie was shaking again, her face pale. "Time to go," Thomas said, and led her quickly away from the crowd. They walked in silence for a while, heading away from town toward the creek that ran along the edge of the settlement. When they reached the water's edge, Maggie sank down onto a fallen log and put her head in her hands. "I hate this," she said, her voice thick with frustration. "I hate being afraid all the time. I hate that he's dead and he still has this power over me." Thomas sat beside her, leaving a careful space between them. "Healing takes time. You can't expect to overcome 5 years of abuse in just a few months." "What if I never heal?" Maggie looked at him, her eyes shining with tears in the moonlight. "What if I'm broken forever?" "You're not broken," Thomas said. "You're healing. There's a difference." Maggie was quiet for a moment, listening to the burble of the creek and the distant sounds of the dance. Then, in a voice so soft he almost didn't hear it, she said, "Would you like to see them?" "The scars." Thomas's heart hammered in his chest. He knew what she was offering, the trust it represented. "Only if you want to show me." Maggie stood up and turned her back to him. With shaking fingers, she began unbuttoning the back of her dress. Thomas waited, barely breathing, as she lowered the fabric off her shoulders, revealing the chemise beneath. Then, slowly, she pulled the chemise down as well. The moonlight illuminated the map of cruelty written on her skin. Long white lines crisscrossed her back, some thin and precise, others thick and jagged. There were round scars that Thomas recognized as burns, and several areas where the skin was puckered and raised from poorly healed wounds. Thomas felt tears prick his own eyes, but he blinked them away. Maggie didn't need his pity. He stood up and stepped closer to her, close enough that she could feel his presence but not close enough to make her uncomfortable. "May I touch them?" he asked softly. Maggie nodded, not trusting her voice. Thomas raised his hand and gently, so gently, traced the path of a scar that ran from her right shoulder blade down toward her spine. Maggie shuddered at the contact but didn't pull away. "This one," Thomas said quietly, "tells a story of survival. This one," he touched another, "speaks of courage. This one shows strength I can barely imagine." He continued mapping her scars with his fingertips, learning the landscape of her pain, and with each touch, each gentle acknowledgement, he could feel Maggie relaxing. Her shoulders, which had been tense and raised, began to lower. Her breathing, which had been quick and shallow, began to slow. "They're ugly," she whispered. "They're beautiful," Thomas corrected, "because they're part of you and you are beautiful, every part of you." Maggie turned to face him then, clutching her dress to her chest but letting him see the tears streaming down her face. "How can you say that?" Thomas reached up slowly, giving her plenty of time to pull away and gently wipe the tears from her cheeks with his thumbs. "Because it's the truth. Your scars don't make you less, Maggie. They make you more. More brave, more strong, more worthy of love than anyone I've ever met." "Love." The word came out as barely a breath. "Yes, love." Thomas let his hands fall away from her face. "I'm in love with you, Maggie Lawson. Have been since the first day you stepped off that stagecoach looking like you were ready to take on the whole world despite everything that had been done to you." Maggie stood frozen, staring at him like she couldn't quite believe what she was hearing. "You can't be. You hardly know me. I know you work harder than anyone I've ever met. I know you're kind to everyone, even when they don't deserve it. I know you love to read but you're embarrassed about it because your husband told you it was a waste of time. I know you hate carrots but you eat them anyway because Mrs. Patterson cooks them. I know you sing when you think no one can hear you and you have the prettiest voice I've ever heard. I know you're brave and strong and remarkable, and yes, I know you have scars, physical ones and ones I can't see, and I love every part of you, including those." "Thomas," Maggie said, and her voice broke on his name. "You don't have to say anything," Thomas said quickly. "I just needed you to know. I needed you to understand that you are worthy of love exactly as you are." But Maggie was shaking her head, and for a terrible moment, Thomas thought he'd pushed too far, said too much. Then she stepped forward and, still clutching her dress to her chest with one hand, reached out with the other and took his hand. "I think," she said slowly, "that I might be falling in love with you too, and that terrifies me more than anything else." Thomas squeezed her hand gently. "Love doesn't have to be terrifying. It can be gentle and safe and good." "I don't know how to do that," Maggie admitted. "The only kind of love I've known was twisted and painful." "Then we'll learn together," Thomas said. "We'll go slow as you need. No pressure, no expectations. Just two people choosing to care for each other." Maggie pulled her dress back up onto her shoulders, and Thomas turned around to give her privacy as she rebuttoned it. When she was finished, she touched his shoulder and they walked back toward town together, their hands linked. The weeks that followed were some of the happiest of Thomas's life, though they were also challenging in ways he hadn't anticipated. Maggie's healing wasn't a straight line, but rather a winding path with advances and setbacks. Some days she was comfortable with his touch, letting him hold her hand or put his arm around her shoulders. Other days, she flinched away from even the gentlest contact, and Thomas had to remind himself that it wasn't about him. It was about the memories her body still carried. He learned to ask permission before touching her, even in small ways. "May I take your hand? Can I sit beside you? Would it be all right if I hugged you?" At first, Maggie seemed surprised by these questions, but gradually she began to relax into the knowledge that she had control, that she could say no without consequences. One particularly difficult day in August, Thomas found Maggie in the boarding house kitchen, staring at a pot of boiling water with an expression of absolute terror on her face. When he called her name, she didn't respond, and Thomas realized she was lost in some terrible memory. He approached her carefully. "Maggie, you're in Nevada City. You're safe. He's not here. He can never hurt you again." Slowly, her eyes focused on him. "He used to hold my hand over the stove," she whispered, "when I burned dinner or talked back or did anything he didn't like." Thomas looked down and noticed, for the first time, small round scars on the backs of her hands. His stomach turned, but he kept his voice steady. "He was a monster and he got far less than he deserved, but he's gone now and you never have to be afraid of being burned again." "I know that in my head," Maggie said, her voice shaking, "but my body doesn't believe it." "That's all right," Thomas said. "Your body is just trying to protect you. It needs more time to learn that it's safe now." He finished cooking the stew for her that day, and Maggie sat at the kitchen table and watched him work, something like wonder in her eyes. "What?" he asked, catching her stare. "I've never had a man cook for me before," she said. "Jacob would have rather starved than do what he considered women's work." "Well, I grew up with just my mother and sister after we left my father," Thomas said, stirring the pot. "We all did what needed doing, regardless of whether it was considered men's work or women's work. Besides, I like cooking. There's something satisfying about taking raw ingredients and turning them into something that nourishes people." "You're nothing like him," Maggie said softly. "Nothing like any man I've ever known." "Good," Thomas said. "I'd hate to think I had anything in common with a man who could hurt someone he was supposed to protect." In September, Mrs. Patterson took a trip to visit her daughter in Sacramento, leaving Maggie in charge of the boarding house for 2 weeks. Thomas made sure to stop by every day, ostensibly to check on things but really just to spend time with Maggie. One evening, he arrived to find her in the parlor, curled up in a chair with a book. She looked up when he entered and smiled, a real, genuine smile that lit up her whole face. "What are you reading?" Thomas asked, settling into the chair across from her. "Jane Eyre," Maggie said, holding up the worn volume. "Have you read it?" "Can't say that I have." "It's about a woman who survives a terrible childhood and grows up to be a governess. She falls in love with her employer, but he's hiding a terrible secret." Maggie's smile turned wistful. I like stories where women survive terrible things and still find happiness. Maybe because you're living one, Thomas suggested gently. Maggie closed the book and set it aside. Thomas, can I ask you something? Anything. Do you really think we can make this work? You and me. I have so much baggage, so many fears and scars, and you're so patient and kind, but I worry that eventually you'll get tired of waiting for me to be normal. Thomas leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. First of all, there's no such thing as normal. Everyone has baggage and fears and scars, even if they're not visible. Second, I'm not waiting for you to be anything other than who you are right now. I love who you are right now. But what about intimacy? Maggie's cheeks flushed, but she pressed on. What about marriage and all that comes with it? I don't know if I can ever be comfortable with that kind of touching. Thomas chose his words carefully. If we ever get married, and that's a big if since I haven't even properly courted you, yet let alone proposed, then we'll figure out that part together. There's no rule that says marriage has to look a certain way. We'll create something that works for both of us, something that respects your boundaries and your healing. You say that now, Maggie said quietly, but most men wouldn't be satisfied with a wife who can't fulfill her marital duties. Then it's a good thing I'm not most men, Thomas said. Maggie, look at me. She lifted her eyes to his. You are more than your body. You are more than what you can or can't do in a bedroom. You're a person with thoughts and feelings and dreams, and those are the things I fell in love with. Everything else will work out if and when we need to. Tears spilled down Maggie's cheeks again, but she was smiling. How did I get so lucky as to find you? I think I'm the lucky one, Thomas said. You chose to trust me with your story, with your scars, with your heart. That's the greatest gift anyone has ever given me. Maggie stood up and walked over to him, and for the first time, she initiated physical contact without prompting. She took both of his hands in hers and squeezed them gently. I want to try, she said. I want to try to build a life with you. I want to try to heal. I want to try to be brave enough to believe in happiness again. Thomas stood up, still holding her hands. Then we'll try together. He kissed her forehead, gentle and chaste, and felt Maggie lean into the touch rather than pull away from it. The autumn months brought cooler weather and a deepening of the relationship between Thomas and Maggie. Thomas began formally courting her, much to Mrs. Patterson's delight, and the townspeople grew accustomed to seeing them walking together in the evenings or sitting on the boarding house porch, talking quietly while the sun set. Thomas took Maggie on picnics in the foothills, where they could be alone with nothing but the mountains and sky around them. He taught her to fish in the creek, laughing when she squealed in surprise the first time she caught something. She taught him about the books she loved, reading passages aloud while he listened with his eyes closed, memorizing the sound of her voice. One crisp October afternoon, they were sitting by the creek when Maggie suddenly said, I want to show you the rest of them. The scars. Thomas looked at her carefully. Are you sure? I'm sure. Maggie stood up and began unbuttoning her dress with more confidence than she'd shown that night back in July. If we're going to build a life together, you should know the full extent of what you're taking on. I already know, Thomas said quietly. But if you want to show me, I'm honored that you trust me enough. Maggie removed her dress and stood before him in just her chemise and petticoat. Even through the thin fabric, Thomas could see the shadows of scars on her arms, her shoulders, her back. Slowly, she removed the chemise as well. Thomas had seen the scars on her back before, but now he could see the full picture. Her arms bore the marks of defensive wounds, places where she'd raised her hands to protect her face and body. Her ribs showed evidence of breaks that had healed poorly. There were burn marks scattered across her torso, and a long scar across her left thigh that looked like it had once been a deep cut. Thomas stood up and began doing what he'd done before, tracing each scar gently with his fingertips, acknowledging each story of pain and survival. But this time he also spoke to them. "This one," he said, touching a thin line on her forearm, "this one shows me you fought back. Good for you. This one," he traced a burn mark on her shoulder, "this one makes me wish I could bring him back just so I could make him pay for what he did to you. This one," he touched the scar on her thigh, "this one must have hurt terribly. I'm sorry you had to go through that alone." He continued around her body, cataloging each mark, each wound, each piece of evidence of what she had survived. Maggie stood still, tears streaming down her face, but she didn't move away. When Thomas had traced the last scar, he stepped back and looked at her face. "You are the bravest person I've ever met, and I will spend the rest of my life making sure that no one ever hurts you again." Maggie threw her arms around his neck and buried her face against his shoulder, sobbing. Thomas held her carefully, one hand on her back, the other cradling her head, and let her cry out all the pain and fear and grief she'd been holding inside. When she finally pulled back, her eyes were red and swollen but somehow lighter than he'd ever seen them. "I love you," she said. "I love you so much it scares me, but I love you." "I love you too," Thomas said. And then, because it felt like the right moment, he knelt down in the grass beside the creek. Maggie's eyes widened. "Maggie Lawson," Thomas said, "I know we've only been courting for a few months, and I know you're still healing, and I know that marriage might be a frightening prospect given what you've been through. But I also know that I want to spend the rest of my life with you. I want to wake up next to you every morning and fall asleep beside you every night. I want to be there for the good days and the hard days. I want to help you heal and watch you grow stronger. I want to build a home with you and maybe, if you want, a family. So I'm asking, will you marry me?" Maggie stared at him for a long moment, and Thomas could see the war playing out in her expression. Fear and hope, doubt and love, all battling for dominance. Finally, she whispered, "Yes." "Yes?" Thomas asked, hardly daring to believe it. "Yes," Maggie said more firmly. "Yes, I'll marry you, Thomas Turner." Thomas stood up and swept her into his arms, spinning her around while she laughed and cried at the same time. When he set her down, he cupped her face in his hands and looked into her eyes. "May I kiss you?" he asked. Maggie nodded, and Thomas leaned in slowly, giving her every opportunity to change her mind. When his lips met hers, it was gentle and sweet, a promise of tenderness and patience and love that would last a lifetime. They were married in November in a small ceremony at the church in Nevada City. Maggie wore a simple white dress that Mrs. Patterson had helped her sew, with long sleeves and a high neck that made her feel safe. Thomas wore his best suit and couldn't stop smiling the entire day. Mrs. Patterson cried happy tears and declared it the most beautiful wedding she'd ever seen. A handful of townspeople attended, people who had grown fond of the quiet young woman who worked at the boarding house and the kind cowboy who had so obviously fallen head over heels for her. After the ceremony, Thomas carried Maggie over the threshold of the small house he'd been building for them on the outskirts of town. He'd been working on it for months, ever since he'd first realized he was in love with her, and he designed every room with her comfort in mind. The bedroom was particularly special. Thomas had installed extra locks on the door and windows at Maggie's request, knowing that she needed to feel secure. He'd also made sure there was a reading chair by the window where she could sit and enjoy her books in natural light. "It's perfect," Maggie said, looking around the bedroom with wonder. "It's absolutely perfect." Thomas came up behind her and wrapped his arms gently around her waist, resting his chin on her shoulder. "I wanted you to have a place where you always feel safe." Maggie turned in his arms to face him. "I feel safe with you. Wherever you are, that's where I feel safe." They stood there for a long moment, holding each other, and then Maggie took a deep breath. "I want to try," she said. "I want to try to be a proper wife to you." Thomas shook his head. "There's no rush, Maggie. We have all the time in the world." "I know," she said, "but I want to try. Not because I think I have to, but because I love you and I want to express that love in every way I can." What followed was slow and gentle and, for Maggie, occasionally difficult. There were moments when her body tensed and her mind flashed back to painful memories, and Thomas would immediately stop and hold her until she felt safe again. There were tears and there were fears, but there was also love and patience and a growing sense of trust and intimacy that had nothing to do with physical touch and everything to do with two souls choosing to be vulnerable with each other. By the time the sun rose the next morning, Maggie was curled up against Thomas's chest, sleeping peacefully for the first time in years without nightmares. Thomas lay awake, one hand gently stroking her hair, feeling overwhelmed with love and gratitude that this incredible woman had chosen to trust him with her healing heart. The first year of their marriage was full of challenges and triumphs. Maggie had days when she struggled with her memories, when loud noises or sudden movements would send her spiraling into panic. Thomas learned to be patient, to give her space when she needed it and comfort when she asked for it. He never raised his voice, never made a sudden move toward her, and always asked permission before touching her. Slowly, Maggie began to heal in ways that went deeper than the physical. She started to believe that she deserved kindness, that she was worthy of love, that her voice and opinions mattered. She began wearing dresses with shorter sleeves, no longer feeling the need to hide her scars from the world. When people stared, Thomas would take her hand and give her a look that said, "Let them stare. You're beautiful." Thomas worked as a ranch hand on one of the larger spreads outside Nevada City, and Maggie continued to help Mrs. Patterson at the boarding house a few days a week. They built a life together that was simple but filled with love and laughter. In the spring of 1877, Maggie discovered she was pregnant. The news filled her with a complicated mix of emotions. Joy, because she and Thomas had talked about wanting children. Fear, because she worried about how pregnancy and childbirth might trigger difficult memories. Anxiety, because she wasn't sure she knew how to be a mother, having had such a poor example in her own father. Thomas held her while she cried about all of her fears, and then he said, "You're going to be an amazing mother. You're kind and patient and strong, and our child will be so lucky to have you." "What if I'm not enough?" Maggie asked. "What if I can't protect our baby the way I couldn't protect myself?" "You were 18 years old and alone and trapped," Thomas said firmly. "That's completely different from being a grown woman with a husband who loves you and a whole community of people who care about you. Our child will be safe and loved, and we'll make sure of it together." The pregnancy was difficult physically, but emotionally it became a healing journey for Maggie. As her body changed and grew, she began to see it not as something damaged and scarred, but as something powerful and miraculous, capable of creating new life. Thomas was attentive throughout, helping with chores when Maggie was too tired, reading to her in the evenings and talking to their unborn child through Maggie's growing belly. In December of 1877, during a snowstorm that blanketed Nevada City in white, Maggie went into labor. Mrs. Patterson and the local midwife, a competent woman named Clara, attended to her while Thomas paced anxiously in the main room of their small house. The labor was long and painful, and there were moments when Maggie was transported back to other moments of pain and fear. But Thomas was allowed in the room, and he held her hand through every contraction, reminding her that this pain was different, that it was bringing life rather than taking it away. Just before dawn, their son was born, tiny and red-faced and perfect. Thomas cut the cord with shaking hands, and then Clara placed the baby in Maggie's arms. Maggie looked down at the tiny face, at the miniature fingers and toes, and felt something break open in her chest. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "I'm your mama, and I promise you will always be safe and loved." Thomas knelt beside the bed, one hand on Maggie's shoulder and one finger gently held in his son's tiny fist. "He's beautiful. You're beautiful. Thank you for giving me this gift." They named him Benjamin Thomas Turner, after Thomas's maternal grandfather, a man who had been kind and gentle in a world that often rewarded cruelty. Motherhood transformed Maggie in ways she hadn't expected. Every time she held Benjamin, every time she nursed him or rocked him to sleep or sang him lullabies, she felt herself healing a little more. This was what love was supposed to look like, she realized. Gentle and nurturing and unconditional. The twisted version of love that Jacob had shown her wasn't love at all. It was possession and control dressed up in love's clothing. Thomas was a devoted father, waking up in the night to change Benjamin's diapers, walking the floor with him when he was fussy, and making silly faces to get him to smile. Watching Thomas with their son made Maggie fall even more deeply in love with her husband. One evening, when Benjamin was about 6 months old, Maggie was nursing him in the rocking chair while Thomas prepared dinner. She watched her husband move around the kitchen with easy competence, humming softly to himself, and felt a wave of contentment wash over her. "Thomas," she said. He looked over at her. "Yes, love, I'm happy." She said it with a note of wonder in her voice. "I never thought I would be able to say that and mean it, but I'm happy." Thomas set down the spoon he'd been using and came over to kneel beside the rocking chair. He looked at Maggie holding their son, and his eyes shone with love. "You deserve to be happy," he said. "You've always deserved it." "I think I'm finally starting to believe that," Maggie said softly. Life continued to unfold in gentle ways. Benjamin grew into a curious, energetic toddler who brought laughter and chaos into their quiet household. In the summer of 1880, Maggie gave birth to their second child, a daughter they named Sarah Rose, after Thomas's sister and Maggie's favorite flower. Maggie sometimes struggled with the demands of caring for 2 young children, especially on days when her past threatened to overwhelm her present. But Thomas was always there, a steady presence who could take over when she needed a break, and who reminded her on the hard days that she was doing better than she thought. The scars on Maggie's body faded somewhat with time, though they would never completely disappear. But more importantly, the scars on her heart began to heal. The nightmares came less frequently. The panic attacks became more manageable. The fear that had once colored every aspect of her life began to recede, replaced by a growing sense of security and peace. She learned to accept comfort, to ask for what she needed, to speak up when something bothered her. She learned that she could disagree with Thomas without him becoming violent, that she could burn dinner or forget to mend his shirt or have an opinion different from his without consequences. She learned that love didn't have to hurt, that it could be soft and safe and good. Thomas continued to trace her scars sometimes, in quiet moments when the children were asleep and they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom. Each touch was a reminder that she was loved, that her past didn't define her future, that she was beautiful exactly as she was. By 1883, their family had grown to include a third child, another son named Daniel. The little house on the outskirts of Nevada City was full of noise and life and love. Thomas had been promoted to foreman at the ranch where he worked, and Maggie had started teaching reading to some of the children in town, having discovered that she had a gift for working with young people who had experienced trauma. One autumn afternoon, Maggie was sitting on the front porch watching Benjamin, now 5 years old, help his father chop wood for the winter while 3-year-old Sarah played with her dolls nearby and baby Daniel napped inside. The sky was a brilliant blue, and the aspens on the hillsides were turning gold. Mrs. Patterson came walking up the path, carrying a basket covered with a cloth. She'd become like a mother to Maggie, filling the role that Maggie's own mother hadn't lived long enough to fill and that her father had never bothered to try. "I brought you some of those apple tarts you like," Mrs. Patterson said, settling herself in the rocking chair next to Maggie's. "You spoil us," Maggie said with a smile, taking the basket. "Someone has to," Mrs. Patterson replied. "Besides, you've given me such joy over these years, my dear. Watching you heal and grow and build this beautiful family, it's been one of the great privileges of my life." Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. "I don't know what I would have done without you. You gave me a chance when I was running from my past with nowhere to go. And you've repaid that faith 1,000 times over," Mrs. Patterson said. She watched Thomas lift Benjamin up onto his shoulders while the boy squealed with delight. "You've built something really special here, Maggie. A family based on love and respect and kindness. That's no small thing." "No," Maggie agreed, her eyes on her husband and children. "It's not." That evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Maggie and Thomas sat together on the porch, wrapped in a quilt against the autumn chill. Maggie's head rested on Thomas's shoulder, and his arm was around her waist. "Do you ever think about what your life might have been like if you'd never come to Nevada City?" Thomas asked. Maggie considered the question. "Sometimes. But honestly, I can't imagine any other life now. This is where I was meant to be. With you, with our children, in this place where I finally learned what it means to be truly loved." Thomas kissed the top of her head. "I love you more every single day. I didn't know that was possible, but it is." "I love you too," Maggie said. "You saved my life, you know. Not just by being kind to me, but by showing me that I was worth saving." "You saved yourself," Thomas corrected gently. "You were the one who had the courage to leave, to start over, to take a chance on trusting someone again. I just got lucky enough to be the man you chose to trust." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, listening to the night sounds around them. An owl hooted in the distance. The wind rustled through the trees. Inside, one of the children murmured something in their sleep. "I want to have more children," Maggie said suddenly. "At least 1 or 2 more." "Is that all right?" Thomas chuckled. "It's more than all right. I love our family and I'd be happy to make it bigger." "Good," Maggie said with satisfaction, "because I think I might already be expecting again." Thomas pulled back to look at her face. "Really?" Maggie nodded, smiling. "I think so. It's early yet, but I'm fairly certain." Thomas let out a whoop of joy and picked Maggie up, spinning her around just like he had that day by the creek when she'd agreed to marry him. Maggie laughed, the sound clear and bright and full of happiness. Over the next several years, their family continued to grow. A 4th son, Matthew, was born in 1884, followed by twin girls, Emma and Elizabeth, in 1886. The house became too small for their growing family, so Thomas built an addition, creating more bedrooms and expanding the kitchen. Maggie thrived as a mother, pouring all the love she'd been denied in her first marriage into raising her children. She taught them to read and write, to be kind to others, to stand up for what was right. She taught her daughters that they were strong and capable, and that no man should ever make them feel otherwise. She taught her sons that real strength lay in gentleness, and that it took more courage to be kind than to be cruel. Thomas taught them all to ride and rope and work with their hands. He taught them about the land and the animals and the importance of doing a job well. But most importantly, he taught them by example what it meant to love and respect a woman. to be a partner rather than a ruler, to see marriage as a collaboration between equals. The children grew up seeing their father trace their mother's scars with gentle fingers, seeing him ask permission before touching her, seeing him support her dreams and encourage her growth. They grew up in a house where voices were never raised in anger, where problems were solved through communication rather than violence, where love was expressed through actions as much as words. Maggie's teaching work expanded over the years. She started a small school in Nevada City, specifically for children who had experienced trauma, working with them to overcome their fears and build their confidence. She used her own story selectively, letting them know that healing was possible, that the terrible things that had happened to them didn't have to define their futures. Thomas supported her work completely, taking on more childcare duties so that Maggie could pursue her passion. He was proud of her, and he made sure she knew it. By the early 1890s, their oldest children were growing into young adults. Benjamin had his father's steady temperament and his mother's compassionate heart. Sarah was bright and determined, with plans to become a teacher like her mother. Daniel was adventurous and curious, always getting into mischief, but with such charm that it was hard to stay angry at him. Maggie stood in the kitchen of their now large house one morning in 1892, preparing breakfast for her family, and marveled at how different her life was from what she'd once imagined. She was 34 years old, mother to 6 children, wife to a man who loved her completely, and teacher to dozens of students who looked up to her. The scars were still there, of course. They would always be there, faint white lines and puckered skin that told the story of her painful past. But they no longer defined her. They were simply part of her story, the dark chapters that made the bright ones all the more precious. Thomas came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist, exactly as he'd done hundreds of times before. Maggie leaned back against him, completely comfortable with his touch, no longer tensing or pulling away. "Good morning, beautiful," he murmured into her ear. "Good morning," she replied, turning her head to kiss his cheek. "Did you sleep well?" "Always do when I'm next to you," Thomas said. "What's on your mind? You have that thoughtful look." "I was just thinking about how grateful I am," Maggie said. "For you, for our children, for this life we've built together. There were times back in Philadelphia when I didn't think I would survive. And even if I did survive, I never imagined I could be happy, but look at us now." Thomas tightened his arms around her. "You've come so far, Maggie. I'm so proud of you." "We've come so far," she corrected. "This was never just my journey. It was ours together." The sound of thundering feet announced the arrival of their younger children, tumbling into the kitchen and clamoring for breakfast. Maggie and Thomas separated to handle the cheerful chaos, working together with the easy coordination of two people who had spent years learning each other's rhythms. As Maggie served pancakes and poured milk and settled arguments about who got to sit where, she caught Thomas's eye across the table. He smiled at her, that same warm smile that had first made her believe she might be worthy of love, and she smiled back. Later that day, after the children had scattered to their various activities and the house was briefly quiet, Maggie found Thomas in the barn, grooming one of the horses. She leaned against the stall door and watched him work, admiring the strength in his shoulders and the gentleness in his hands. "I want to show the children," she said suddenly. Thomas looked up from his work. "Show them what?" "My scars." Maggie took a deep breath. "They're old enough now, most of them anyway, and I think it's important that they understand where I came from, what I survived. I want them to know that their mother was once someone who was hurt and broken, but that she healed. I want them to know that healing is possible, no matter how dark things seem." Thomas set down the brush and came over to her, taking her hands in his. "Are you sure?" That's a heavy conversation to have with children. I'm sure, Maggie said. Not with the little ones, obviously, but Benjamin is 15 now and Sarah is 13 and Daniel is 11. They're old enough to understand. And I want them to hear it from me in my own words, rather than piecing together rumors or wondering why their mother dresses differently than other women. Then I support you completely, Thomas said. Do you want me there with you? Yes, Maggie said immediately. I always want you there. That evening after dinner, Maggie and Thomas called their 3 oldest children into the parlor. The younger ones were put to bed early, with Matthew promising to keep the twins entertained in their room. Benjamin, Sarah, and Daniel sat on the sofa, looking curious and slightly worried. Maggie stood by the fireplace, Thomas beside her with his hand on the small of her back. There's something I need to tell you, Maggie began. Something about my past that I think you're old enough to understand now. She told them, in simple but honest terms, about her first marriage. About the violence and the cruelty and the fear. About the scars on her body and the wounds on her soul. She didn't go into graphic detail, but she didn't sugarcoat it either. The children listened with wide eyes, and Maggie saw a range of emotions cross their faces. Shock, anger, sadness, and something that looked like fierce protectiveness. When she was finished, there was a long silence. Then Benjamin, her firstborn, stood up and crossed to where she stood. He was already taller than her, well on his way to being as tall as his father, and there were tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry that happened to you, Mama," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I'm so glad you got away. I'm so glad you found Papa and built this family with him." Sarah came next, wrapping her arms around Maggie's waist and burying her face against her mother's shoulder. "You're the bravest person I know," she whispered, "and I want to be just like you when I grow up." Daniel, at 11, was less articulate but no less sincere. He took his mother's hand and said simply, "I love you, Mama, and if anyone ever tried to hurt you again, I would protect you." Maggie gathered all 3 of them into her arms, and Thomas wrapped his arms around all of them, and they stood there together, a tangle of love and tears and fierce devotion. "This is why it's so important to choose your partners carefully," Maggie said when they'd all separated and settled back down. "Marriage should be based on mutual respect and love, not possession and control. Your father has shown me what real love looks like, and that's the standard I want all of you to hold out for." "Did you ever stop having nightmares?" Sarah asked quietly. "About what happened to you?" "They still come sometimes," Maggie admitted, "but much less often than they used to. And your father always helps me through them. Healing isn't a straight line, and there's no finish line where you're suddenly all better. It's an ongoing process, but it does get easier with time and with the support of people who love you." They talked for another hour, the children asking questions and Maggie answering them as honestly as she could while still being age-appropriate. Thomas added his perspective occasionally, talking about the importance of patience and understanding when someone you love is healing from trauma. When the conversation finally wound down, Benjamin said, "Mama, could we see them? The scars." Maggie looked at Thomas, who nodded supportively. She turned back to her children and said, "If you want to, yes." She unbuttoned the cuffs of her sleeves and rolled them up, revealing the scars on her forearms. Then she turned around and loosened the back of her dress enough to show them her shoulders and upper back. The children looked at the map of pain written on their mother's skin, and Maggie could tell they were processing what it meant, the reality of what she had survived. "They're part of what made me who I am," Maggie said, pulling her sleeves back down and rebuttoning her dress. "I'm not ashamed of them anymore. They're proof that I survived, that I'm strong enough to overcome terrible things, and they remind me every day to be grateful for the life I have now." That conversation became a turning point for their family. The older children had a deeper understanding of their mother's strength and their father's kindness. They saw their parents' relationship through new eyes, recognizing it as something special and worthy of emulation. As the years continued to pass, Maggie's healing journey continued as well. She would never completely forget what had been done to her, and she would always carry those memories and scars. But she learned to integrate them into her story rather than letting them define it. She continued her teaching work, and eventually wrote a small book about healing from domestic violence that was published by a press in San Francisco. It wasn't widely distributed, but it found its way to women who needed it, and Maggie received letters from readers thanking her for giving them hope. Thomas continued to be her rock, her safe harbor, her reminder that love could be gentle and good. He never stopped asking permission before touching her, even after decades of marriage. He never stopped tracing her scars with gentle fingers and reminding her that she was beautiful. He never stopped being patient with her hard days and celebrating her victories on the good ones. Their children grew up and started their own families, each of them choosing partners who treated them with respect and kindness. Maggie and Thomas became grandparents, and then great-grandparents, presiding over a family tree that was rooted in love and nourished by compassion. In the spring of 1910, Maggie and Thomas celebrated their 32nd wedding anniversary. They were in their early 50s now, their hair showing threads of silver, their faces lined with the evidence of lives well lived. They took a walk together up to the creek where Thomas had first proposed, the same creek where he had first traced her scars and told her she was beautiful. They sat on the bank, holding hands and watching the water flow past, and Maggie thought about the girl she'd been when she first arrived in Nevada City all those years ago. Frightened and scarred and convinced she would never be whole again. "What are you thinking about?" Thomas asked, reading her expression like he always could. "About how far I've come," Maggie said. "About how that scared girl on the stagecoach could never have imagined this life, this happiness." "You were always strong enough to get here," Thomas said. "You just needed someone to believe in you until you could believe in yourself." "I needed you," Maggie said simply. "I needed your patience and your kindness and your unwavering faith that I was worth loving." "You were always worth loving," Thomas said. "You always will be." They sat in silence for a while longer, comfortable in each other's presence after more than 3 decades together. Then Maggie said, "Thank you." "For what?" "For seeing past the scars. For loving all of me, even the broken parts. For showing me that there was life after pain, happiness after sorrow. For being exactly the man I needed you to be." Thomas brought her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. "You don't need to thank me for loving you. It's the easiest thing I've ever done." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, they walked back down to their house. Smoke curled from the chimney, where their youngest children were preparing dinner. Grandchildren played in the yard, their laughter carrying on the evening breeze. Maggie paused at the gate and looked at the home they'd built together, literally and figuratively. It was full of love and light and laughter, everything her first marriage had lacked. Thomas came up beside her and put his arm around her shoulders. "Happy anniversary, my love." "Happy anniversary," Maggie replied, leaning into his embrace. They stood there together, watching their family, and Maggie felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. The scars were still there, would always be there, but they no longer hurt. They were simply part of her story, the dark chapters that made the bright ones all the more precious. She had survived. She had healed. And most importantly, she had learned to love and be loved in return. And that, Maggie thought as Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple, was the greatest victory of all. In the years that followed, Maggie and Thomas continued to be pillars of their community. Maggie's school for traumatized children grew and expanded, eventually becoming a formal institution supported by donations from wealthy benefactors who recognized the importance of her work. She trained other teachers in her methods, spreading her philosophy of patient, compassionate education. Thomas became a respected elder in Nevada City, known for his fairness and wisdom. He served on the town council and helped mediate disputes, always advocating for solutions that prioritized human dignity and understanding. Their children all thrived in their own ways. Benjamin became a rancher like his father, but with a progressive approach that emphasized the humane treatment of animals and workers. Sarah fulfilled her dream of becoming a teacher and eventually took over her mother's school. Daniel became a lawyer, specializing in helping women escape abusive marriages, inspired by his mother's story. Matthew became a doctor, treating patients with compassion and patience. The twins, Emma and Elizabeth, were inseparable and eventually opened a boarding house together in Sacramento, running it with the same kindness that Mrs. Patterson had shown their mother all those years ago. Mrs. Patterson herself lived to the ripe old age of 87, passing peacefully in her sleep in 1895 with Maggie holding her hand. Her funeral was attended by hundreds of people whose lives she'd touched, and Maggie gave a eulogy that brought tears to every eye in the church. "She gave me a chance when I needed one most," Maggie said, standing at the pulpit with her family behind her. "She saw past my fear and my scars to the person I could become. She was a mother to me when I had no mother, a friend when I had no friends, a champion when I had no one to fight for me. The world is a little darker without her light, but we can honor her memory by extending the same kindness to others that she showed to us." As Maggie grew older, she found that her past hurt less and less. The nightmares stopped almost entirely. The panic attacks became rare. She could talk about what had happened to her without breaking down, could even use her story to help others without being triggered by the memories. She credited Thomas for much of her healing, but Thomas always insisted that she had done the hard work herself. "I just loved you," he would say. "You're the one who chose to heal, who put in the effort to overcome your trauma and build a new life. All I did was provide a safe place for you to do that work." In 1920, when Maggie was 62 and Thomas was 64, they celebrated their 42nd wedding anniversary. They were great-grandparents several times over now, presiding over a family that numbered in the dozens. Their children threw them a party, inviting everyone in Nevada City who had been touched by their lives. The celebration was held in the town square, where decorations were hung and tables were laden with food. Maggie stood at the center of it all, surrounded by children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Thomas came up beside her and took her hand, and she looked up at him with eyes that still held all the love they'd held on their wedding day, only deeper and richer for the years they'd spent together. "We did pretty well, didn't we?" Thomas said, looking around at their family. "We did better than well," Maggie replied. "We built something beautiful out of pain and fear. We created love where there was once only hurt." Their eldest grandson, Benjamin's son Thomas Jr., stood up to make a toast. He was a strapping young man of 22, with his grandfather's steady presence and his grandmother's compassionate heart. "My grandparents," he began, his voice carrying across the crowd, "are proof that love can overcome anything. My grandmother came to Nevada City as a young widow, scarred and scared and convinced she would never be whole again. My grandfather saw past those scars to the incredible woman beneath, and he loved her with such patience and gentleness that she was able to heal." He paused, his eyes shining with emotion. They built a marriage based on respect and kindness, and they raised their children with those same values. Because of them, everyone in our family knows what real love looks like. We know that it's patient and gentle and safe. We know that it asks permission and respects boundaries and honors the dignity of the other person. Thomas Jr. raised his glass. To Grandma Maggie and Grandpa Thomas, thank you for showing us all what it means to truly love someone. Thank you for building a family rooted in compassion. And thank you for 42 years of being an example of everything that's right and good in this world. To Maggie and Thomas, the crowd echoed, raising their glasses. Maggie felt tears streaming down her face, but they were happy tears, tears of joy and fulfillment and overwhelming love. Thomas put his arm around her and held her close, and she could feel his own tears dampening her hair. Later that night, after the party had ended and they'd returned to their now empty house, Maggie and Thomas sat together on the porch just as they had countless times over the years. The stars were brilliant overhead, and the night air was sweet with the scent of blooming flowers. "I never told you," Maggie said quietly, "about the promise I made to myself on the stagecoach when I was coming to Nevada City." Thomas looked at her with interest. "What promise was that?" "I promised myself that if I could just survive, if I could just make it through one more day and then another, maybe eventually I would find a life worth living. I didn't dare hope for happiness. I just wanted to survive." She turned to look at Thomas, her eyes reflecting the starlight. "You gave me so much more than survival. You gave me joy and love and a family and a purpose. You gave me a life beyond my wildest dreams." Thomas cupped her face in his hands, those same hands that had traced her scars with such gentleness all those years ago. "You gave me just as much, Maggie. You gave me the privilege of loving you, of watching you heal and grow and blossom. You gave me children and grandchildren and a life full of meaning. You made me a better man just by letting me be part of your journey." They kissed then, a sweet kiss that held the tenderness of more than 4 decades together, and Maggie marveled at how far they'd come from that first nervous, gentle kiss on their wedding night. As they sat together under the stars, Maggie's hand unconsciously went to her arm, tracing the faint lines of scars that had faded with time but would never completely disappear. Thomas noticed the gesture and covered her hand with his own. "I love your scars," he said, not for the first time but with as much sincerity as ever. "Every single one of them, because they're part of the story of how you became the woman I love." "I love them too now," Maggie said, and she realized it was true. "Not because of what they represent, but because they're proof that I survived. They're proof that pain doesn't have to be the end of the story. They're proof that healing is possible." She looked down at their joined hands, hers still bearing the small round scars from burns, his work worn and calloused but always gentle. "They're also proof that there are people in the world like you, people who see past the damage to the person beneath. People who love not in spite of scars but including them, understanding that they're part of the whole package." As the months and years continued to pass, Maggie's health began to decline. She was diagnosed with a weak heart, and the doctor told her to take it easy, to rest more and work less. But Maggie had never been good at sitting still, and she continued teaching and writing and spending time with her family as much as she was able. Thomas remained devoted, caring for her with the same patience and gentleness he'd always shown. When she was too tired to walk, he carried her. When she was frustrated with her limitations, he listened and comforted. When she was afraid of dying, he held her and reminded her that they'd had a beautiful life together, and that was something to be celebrated, not mourned. In the spring of 1925, Maggie took a turn for the worse. She was 67 years old and had lived a long, full life, but knowing that didn't make it easier for Thomas or their children. As she lay in bed, surrounded by her family, Maggie looked around at all the faces she loved and felt at peace. Her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren filled the room, spanning generations of love and kindness that she and Thomas had set in motion. Thomas sat beside her, holding her hand, his eyes red from crying but his expression composed for her sake. "Don't be sad," Maggie whispered to them all. "I've had such a beautiful life, more than I ever dreamed possible." "Because of you, Mama," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Because you were brave enough to start over, to trust again, to build something beautiful out of pain." "Because of your father," Maggie corrected gently, her eyes on Thomas. "Because he showed me what love was supposed to look like." She squeezed Thomas's hand weakly. "I'm not afraid," she told him. "Not anymore. You taught me that I didn't have to be afraid." "I love you," Thomas said, his voice breaking. "I've loved you since the moment I saw you, and I'll love you until the moment I die and beyond." "I know," Maggie said with a soft smile. "I've always known. And I love you too. Thank you for giving me a life worth living. Thank you for every gentle touch, every patient word, every moment of kindness. Thank you for seeing me when I felt invisible, for loving me when I felt unlovable, for believing in me when I couldn't believe in myself." She took a labored breath. "Promise me something." "Anything," Thomas said. "Promise me you'll keep living, not just surviving. Promise me you'll find joy and purpose, and that you'll keep spreading the love we built together. And promise me you'll tell our story, so that other women trapped in darkness know that there's light on the other side." "I promise," Thomas said, bringing her hand to his lips and kissing it tenderly. Maggie closed her eyes, a peaceful expression on her face. "Good, that's good." Her voice was fading now, growing softer with each word. "I can rest now. I can finally rest." She took one more breath, let it out slowly, and was gone. The room erupted in quiet sobs, but Thomas just sat there, still holding her hand, tears streaming silently down his face. He stayed that way for hours, unwilling to let her go, until finally their children gently convinced him to come away so they could prepare her body for burial. Maggie's funeral was the largest Nevada city had ever seen. Hundreds of people came to pay their respects to the woman who had overcome so much and had dedicated her life to helping others do the same. Former students spoke about how she had changed their lives. Her children eulogized her strength and compassion. Her grandchildren read passages from her book about healing. But it was Thomas who gave the final eulogy, standing at the pulpit in the same church where they'd been married 47 years earlier. His voice was steady despite his grief, and his words painted a picture of a love that had transformed two broken people into something whole and beautiful. "Maggie came to me covered in scars, inside and out," he said. "Scars from a life of pain and cruelty and fear. But those scars didn't define her. They were just chapters in her story, dark chapters that made the bright ones all the more meaningful." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces. "I loved every one of those scars, not because I enjoyed seeing evidence of her pain, but because each one was proof that she had survived. Each one was proof that she was stronger than the man who had hurt her. Each one was proof that pain doesn't have to be the end of the story." Thomas's voice grew stronger. "Maggie taught me that healing is possible, that love can be gentle and safe, that it's never too late to start over. She taught our children and grandchildren the same lessons, and through them, those lessons will continue to spread for generations to come." He looked down at the simple wooden casket that held his beloved wife. "I'm going to miss her every single day for the rest of my life, but I'm also going to celebrate every single day we had together. 47 years of marriage, 6 children, countless grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and a love story that proved that second chances are real and that healing is possible and that scars can be beautiful. "Rest well, my love," he said softly. "You've earned your peace." Thomas lived for another 8 years after Maggie's death. He never remarried, though there were several women who would have been interested. When asked why, he simply said, "I had the love of my life. I don't need another one." He kept his promise to Maggie, continuing to live rather than just survive. He spent time with his family, continued his work in the community, and wrote a book of his own about loving someone through trauma. It was published alongside Maggie's book, and the 2 volumes together became important resources for people dealing with domestic violence and trauma recovery. He also started a foundation in Maggie's name that provided funding for schools and programs that helped trauma survivors. It grew over the years, eventually operating in multiple states and helping thousands of people. Thomas died peacefully in his sleep in 1933 at the age of 77. His children found him in his favorite chair on the porch, a slight smile on his face, as if he'd died dreaming of happy things. In his lap was a photograph of Maggie taken on their wedding day, her face young and hopeful and beautiful. At his funeral, which was as well attended as Maggie's had been, their children spoke about the legacy their parents had left. Not just a large family, though that was significant. Not just books and foundations and programs, though those were important, but a legacy of love and kindness and the belief that everyone deserves to be treated with dignity and respect. "Our parents showed us that love doesn't have to hurt," Benjamin said, now an elderly man himself. "They showed us that patience and gentleness are strengths, not weaknesses. They showed us that scars, whether visible or invisible, don't have to define us. They showed us that healing is possible and that second chances are real." He looked around at his siblings, his children, his grandchildren, all of them products of the love that Maggie and Thomas had built together. That's their real legacy, not the buildings or the books or the programs, as important as those are. But the love they spread, the kindness they showed, the hope they gave to people who had lost hope. That's what will continue long after we're all gone. Thomas was buried next to Maggie in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Nevada City. Their headstone was simple, bearing just their names, the years of their births and deaths, and a single line. Their love healed wounds and inspired generations. And it did. The foundation they started continued to grow and evolve, helping trauma survivors for more than a century. Their books were translated into multiple languages and distributed around the world. Their children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren continued to spread their message of love and healing through their own lives and work. But more than any of that, their story became legend in Nevada City. It was passed down through generations, told and retold until it took on the quality of myth. The young widow with the hidden scars and the patient cowboy who loved her despite them. The marriage built on gentleness and respect. The family rooted in compassion. The legacy of healing that spread far beyond one small town in California. In the decades and even centuries that followed, people would come to Nevada City, looking for the house where Maggie and Thomas had lived, the creek where he had first told her she was beautiful, the church where they had been married. The town preserved these places, recognizing them as monuments to the power of love to heal even the deepest wounds. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the wind blew just right, people swore they could hear laughter coming from the old Turner homestead. The laughter of children playing, of a man and woman sharing a private joke, of a family gathered together in love and joy. Perhaps it was just the wind, or the settling of old timbers, or the overactive imagination of romantic souls. But those who believed in the power of love that transcends even death liked to think it was Maggie and Thomas, still together in whatever came after, still loving each other with the same gentle intensity that had defined their marriage and life. Their story had proven that scars didn't have to be the end, that pain didn't have to be permanent, that love could heal even the deepest wounds. It had shown that second chances were real, that happiness could be found after despair, that it was never too late to start over. And that legacy, built on gentle touches and patient words, and the revolutionary act of loving someone completely, scars and all, continued to inspire people to believe in the possibility of healing, the power of kindness, and the enduring strength of love that sees past the surface to the beautiful soul beneath. It was a story that would be told as long as there were people who needed to hear it, a reminder that no matter how deep the scars, no matter how profound the pain, there was always hope for healing and the possibility of love.